Hi everyone, today we're going to be talking about the French and Indian War. So today on page 5 in your notebooks, you want to do 2.2, French and Indian War. Make sure you put today's date. Leave space for the objective. On the left-hand side, you want to have causes, first conflict, war declared, early battles, turning point, British victory, 1763 Treaty of Paris, and effects, and we will fill in the right-hand side as we go through the lesson today. You may want to pause for a moment to ensure you get this all down. The objective for today is that by the end of class, you will be able to identify the causes and effects of the French and Indian War by taking notes and completing a handout. The essential question for today was, what was the impact of the French and Indian War? A little bit of background information about the French and Indian War. Essentially, there was just a long-standing rivalry between France and England over territory in the New World. And you can get a better idea on the map here. What British claimed, what France claimed. France is right in between the British and the English, or the British and British colonies. And right here, you can see yellow and pink, and this is where there was a lot of disputed land between the French and the British, where a lot of the conflict happened. Some of the causes of the French and Indian War were, again, the English and French fighting over the same exact territory as we see right here on this map. And this is a better shot of it. It's a little bit more of a close-up of that territory. And as you can see, there's some British forts that are pretty close to some French forts. Those aren't very far away from one another, and it caused a lot of tension. You may recognize this gentleman. He was our first president, George Washington, and he became famous during the French and Indian War. He was involved in the first conflict of the French and Indian War. In 1754, young Major George Washington was defeated by the French in Ohio and were forced to return back to Virginia. Eventually, war was declared. War was declared in 1756 after the British sent a second general, Edward Braddock, to drive the French out of the Ohio Valley. However, he too was defeated in 1755, and so right after that was when war was declared in 1756. You have to remember, communication at this time was pretty slow, so it took a while for them to communicate back and forth what actions they were going to take. So even though it's been a few years, in that time period, that was pretty common. Some of the early battles. France and the Allies dominated the first 3 years of the war. And when we say France and we say the Allies, the French had partnered up with a lot of natives in that area, as did the English. So both sides partnered up with different tribes of natives to help fight in the war. And France was very successful in those first 3 years. But then the turning point happened with British Foreign Minister William Pitt. He helped turn the tide in 1758. So after France dominated those first 3 years, he eventually, Minister William Pitt, made peace with important Indian allies. And when he did that, he adopted their way of fighting. So instead of kind of marching towards one another like traditionally had been done, this is where we start to see our first type of guerrilla warfare, where we see people kind of hiding and stalking and then fighting and attacking. And that turned out to be very helpful for the British, and what eventually allowed them to win the war. British declared victory in 1756 when they gained control British started to essentially led them to victory in 1759 when they gained control of Fort Niagara. And Fort Niagara cut off the French frontier forts, and that's what led to the English victory. So essentially what happened is the fort was around in this general vicinity. And remember, France had a couple forts down here, most of French territory was up in this area. And so when the British cut this off, France could no longer get supplies to those forts. And that's what eventually led to the victory for England. In 1763, a treaty was drawn up called the Treaty of Paris. Essentially, it said that France lost Canadian colonies and any of the claims to the land east of the Mississippi River. So here's the Mississippi River. We have never eat soggy waffles. So any land that they had in this general vicinity, they lost in the treaty. Spain ended up with the French territory west of the Mississippi. So you can see right here, Spanish Louisiana. That's where Spain ended up with their territory. Oh, sorry, guys. And finally, England got all of the French territory in Canada and in Florida. So now you can see at one point in time, this area right in here was all controlled by France, and now it's all controlled by England, which is why we speak English instead of French. This just kind of gives you a better idea of the boundaries before the war and after the war. You can see this area right here was where they were disputing a lot of the land. After the war, all became English territory. Effects of the war, and these are pretty important because this is what eventually led us to the Declaration of Independence and the Revolutionary War. England issued a proclamation of 1763, which essentially prevented colonists from moving any further west and expanding into the western frontier. In addition to that, they also put on a variety of taxes on the colonists to help pay for the war. And this was really what ended up angering a lot of the colonists, is their inability to pay for some of these taxes, and they did not want to have to pay for the war. This caused friction to increase between the colonies and Great Britain. We will get more into that in our third lesson on specifically what those frictions were. And you don't need to worry about that one. All right, so that is it for today.